so it doesn't eat sheep. The Iberian, yeah. The Pardell lynx. It's very close to the European lynx, except that it would go up to about 15 kilograms. Your average pussycat is maximum about 3 or 4 kilograms if you overfeed it. But so 15 kilogram lynx, I mean this would have a hard time killing a beaver, let alone a sheep. And it's a rabbit specialist, and it's being virtually wiped out in Spain since rabbit hemorrhagic disease, which is rather like myxomatosis. What goes through the whole rabbit population. So the Spanish lynx is on the verge of extinction, and there are a lot of connections actually between Iberian species of plants and the southwest of England and southwest of Ireland. And so I've actually said, bring the Spanish species into Dartmoor if we were going to look for it, because it won't trouble the sheep, and it'll feed on the rabbits. Rabbits are not native to Britain anyway. Neither are pheasants, red-legged partridges, the brown rat, the hare. So actually, most of the game animals in the British countryside are imports anyway. They're aliens. Now, the International Union for Conservation of Nature rules and regulations would prohibit us from bringing the Spanish lynx in simply because it was never here. That's the only reason. It would be perfectly at home in Dartmoor, although it might be a little bit wet. Now, by the time you get to Scandinavia, you're dealing with a much bigger animal. Twice that, up to 30 kilograms. No record of a lynx ever causing a human being a problem, but at that size and power, they will eat the occasional sheep. But the lynx is a forest animal, so unless you have sheep in the forest or near the forest edge, you don't have a problem with lynx eating sheep. So, for example, most of the Eastern European forests, there's no sheep culture. By the time you get to Norway, the Norwegians actually encourage their sheep to go into the forest, and rather like Scotland, they're kind of free-ranging, they're not very well looked after. So they have a significant impact on sheep farmers. They don't have that much impact on the sheep themselves in terms of percentages, but something about the culture there of losing your sheep to a predator triggers the hunting, culling response.
Just to clarify what you're saying about Norway, it's quite a significant number of sheep that are taken each year. We're looking at about 6,000 a year from lynx predation. All of those incidents are compensated for retrospectively by the government, which isn't such a great way of going about dealing with the conflict. So we're talking about millions of pounds worth of money being given to farmers, and at the moment the reason why those figures stay so high is because the farmers are getting that money in their back pockets, and there's no incentive for them to change their animal husbandry and change graze their sheep away from these forests, because you're looking about, I think there's a study done in Switzerland, 90% of sheep depredation incidents were occurring within 200 metres from the forest. So if you were able to move the sheep that were over the age of or under the age of 1 away from that edge, then that might actually...
There's an interesting question there, because with regard to the Norwegians are rather like that also with wolf, but over the border in Sweden, rather than paying for the losses from the wolf, the government pay the farmers or the landowners if they have wolf on their land. So they get a payment for every breeding couple of wolves. I don't know if the same thing operates.
They're doing it as well in northern Sweden.
Yeah.
So you've got the Sami, indigenous tribal people. They'll be out looking for evidence of lynx kittens, new families breeding on their land, because they're going to get an amount of money per new regeneration. So So I think that's what they're trying to persuade the Norwegians to do at the moment. I think it'll save them a lot of money, and also changes the attitude that we have towards the animal. We don't see them as a nuisance, we see them as an opportunity to bring in potentially wildlife tourism.
And the bigger animals from the kind of Central European subspecies and the Scandinavian animals are very efficient at killing deer. They're specialists on roe deer, and they do have an effect on roe deer populations. So again, there would be ample habitat for them in Scotland, where there is sheep rearing, but it's not. There are large areas where it's mostly hunting, shooting, fishing country. Whereas Wales would be another problem, a problem area. Likewise, Kielder, because you have sheep farmers nearby, so you'd have to deal with that issue.
Massive.
But my sense is that if you're
It's a lynx taking a sheep.
if you're dealing with a large forested area, then lynx are pretty much going to stay within the forest as long as there's deer for them to eat. Welsh forests have virtually no deer. Many people don't know, but the roe deer, for example, was virtually exterminated in Britain, and certainly the English populations of roe deer were reintroduced. Likewise, the squirrel, the red squirrel, was virtually exterminated and was reintroduced.
I think you've got more deer now in Britain than we had recorded in the Doomsday Book, despite the tremendous loss of forest in comparison to those times. So just to, I think, yeah.
So that's a little bit of the background. I'm not a lynx specialist, but I can answer certain questions on the biology. But obviously it's another charismatic, iconic species. The main problem will be is nobody will ever see one. You know, they're actually sightings in the Mendips, and one lynx was shot in Norfolk in 1991, and James was just telling me it's been stuffed and is available. You can see it in King's Lynn. So again, from a point of view of tourist attractions, it's kind of limited, except that in the Harz Mountains, it's a major advertising program for bringing tourists to the Harz Mountains. So we've reintroduced the lynx quite successfully, and that would be a similar sort of area and forest type to Kielder, mostly plantations, and certainly needing or welcoming deer control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just to talk about Harz National Park in Germany, I think they started their reintroduction program in '99. They reintroduced about 20 pairs of lynx, and at the time they had the hunting lobby on their side from the outset. I'm not entirely sure whether they are being hunted as game species now they've returned. That's something that probably would need to be debated here in the UK if it did become a serious proposition. But since they've reintroduced lynx to Harz, they've had quite a considerable increase in tourism, and the way that they've done it in Harz is they've used what's called a soft release pen. So they've just fenced off, say, 300 metre by 300 metre squared area of the forest, and they've brought in captive bred lynx, I think, and just kind of got them used to the idea of being in the forest, being in the wild, and a couple of those lynx weren't suitable for release. They were too kind of they enjoyed human company too much, which is an issue. You don't want lynx to be habituated, that's the word, yeah. So what they did was they kept them in these pens. I think it may have been larger than 300 metres, but they were pretty happy in there. And what they've done is they've used that as a kind of centre for visitors to come and learn about lynx biology, and they are fed, every day, and hundreds of tourists coming in to see them. So, as you were saying, they are quite elusive species. There's ecologists in Slovakia who've been working with lynx for 15 years or so. They've only seen them on 2 occasions. So it's important to have those types of facilities, I think, in order to get the economic benefits of these types of trials. So, for example, a hotelier that runs a restaurant quite close to that area, he's had, I think, a doubling in business, and as a result, he set up a donation box, for example, to go on next to his door to keep that project alive. But just to give you an example, really, of how it can work.
The issue of the trophic cascade and the way the predator shifts the herbivores, normally the deer, around and allows the forest to regenerate because parts are not overgrazed too much. Does that happen much? Is there much evidence that you can point to in Europe for that, the lynx doing that?
Not with lynx. That happens with wolf, for sure. But I'm not aware of any evidence that it affects grazing patterns. But what it will do...
Puma in the States.
Yeah. What it will do is lynx will not tolerate foxes. So that is a particular effect, largely because they're a competitor for many of its food items. So it's a form of fox control in a way.
We have got far too many deer in the country now. Not just the roe deer, the muntjac, presumably that could be prey for lynx.
Absolutely.
I mean, the southeast, Surrey is the most wooded county in the country, and the Sussex Weald would be ideal for them. I mean, the southeast is full of muntjac deer, and these deer do, of course, do damage. They sometimes damage the young saplings. They eat the plants like orchids that we like, and of course they're real problem for birds like woodcock, brown nesting bird, so which really has decreased in number. So deer are a problem, and after all, there are these big cats living in the wild. I mean, I've found and photographed claw marks on a tree that were far too big to be any native creature, and I did ask, they said, oh yes, a puma's been seen back there. This was in South Wales. So they are living quite happily, presumably living off rabbits and deer.
I find some people who are really relate to the brown hare are worried about sort of lynx and big cat issues. So that there are, you may say that's nitpicking, but it's interesting that some ecologists and some people who are purists about their own sort of nature that they love worry about the predator doing things to.
But brown hare isn't a native species.
I do point that out. It's a sort of an honorary one, isn't it? It's been here so long.
Plus,
a lot of people are attached to it very deep.
It's unlikely to be a problem because the lynx are going to be pretty much a forest animal.
Yeah. I'll just take one point from David, and then we'll get back to any points that James wants to add.
I think I can see how it would be easy to sell the beaver population. I think one of the worries that, and it's probably an ignorant worry, but one of the worries that a lot of landowners have is a population explosion. That we introduce an animal, and because there are so many rabbits and there are so many deer, that actually the spread of that animal goes exponential, and we can't control it. And it actually goes from being, because of interestingly with the red kites in the Chilterns, as I understand it, I'm no expert, because of the amount of discarded food on the side of roads and their natural scavengers, one of their favourite places to scavenge is outside McDonald's and stuff. And I don't know what the natural population of red kites would be in the Chilterns, but they've got this crazy number, they've been a huge success, I must say. But I could imagine a landowner, possibly with both beaver and lynx, but more so lynx, thinking, well, everything's slightly out of balance now anyway. We've got rabbits all over the place. We've got deer, as has been said, particularly in the south of England, with muntjac going mad. Are we going to end up with we'll have to go to I assume you get into ranges and eventually things will settle themselves down, but are we going to go through a major population explosion first, which is unacceptable perhaps to some's eyes, before it then gets back to some sort of natural balance?
in all the references on large cats, it appears that they do regulate their territories and regulate their numbers in relation to the prey. So I mean, that is an information issue. My other experience of dealing with landowners who think they may have a cat around is that they often tolerate it because they think the vermin control benefit is it's doing a job, and they can see they think it's doing a job, and they think that's a good job. And if it does misbehave, then they might think differently. But I think also cub mortality can be high.
It's more likely to balance things out than it is to make the problem worse. Yeah.
But there's never been any problem in Europe with any of the introduction. The problem is keeping the numbers up, not keeping them down.
I think I would disagree with that. If you're talking about lynx anyway, there's been quite a significant amount of conflict between
Conflict, yes, but the numbers haven't got out of hand.
Perhaps not, but it doesn't take that many lynx to make a significant dent on a farmer's small holding of sheep if they're in the wrong place, for example. So I think it depends on the area which you're looking at. I think if we draw a picture of how this might happen in Scotland, I imagine a place like Kintyre, for example, a peninsula, where you can perhaps keep the animals in a place for quite a significant amount of time, perhaps 5-10 years, before you allow them to become dispersed. Beyond that, if it becomes a sensible idea. So what I'm trying to say here is that the number of sheep, for example, in the Highlands is declining at the moment as a result of the decoupling of common agricultural payments, the amount of money that's given to farmers to farm sheep. So you've got this kind of shift almost of sheep from the Highlands to the east coast, and that would make it quite difficult for a lynx to get along, I think, with the landowners on the east coast. And I think there's places would be more suited to have lynx, and other places that wouldn't, and that there may need to be some kind of regional zoning system to cater for that. I don't know.
I mean, is there an issue of some parts of Europe have got less alternative, where sheep predation is high, have got less alternative natural prey, whereas some parts of Britain have got a huge variety of alternative natural prey, so prey switching would not to livestock would be rare.
Yeah, probably.
In
Yeah.
extreme circumstances.
We've only had, I think it was in Switzerland, they used to have about 120 sheep killed from lynx each year, and I think it was 2006 they only had 15. Just by getting the message out to the farmers that this is, if you keep your sheep in the woods or close to the forest, then this is what happens. And perhaps, I think in Slovakia anyway, the main concern is wolf and bear, where you've got sheep missing in the hundreds. I think lynx predation, I think they recorded it at 4 maybe in total last year. That was Robin Rigg of Oxford University, who's associated with the Slovak Wildlife Society, and he's doing quite a lot of work with livestock guarding dogs. That's what he's dedicated his profession to, and that's something that I suppose we've lost here in the UK. That sort of knowledge of that tradition of sheep husbandry that could actually make an impact. Sorry.
Would lynx prey on wild boar?
They certainly would take the young ones, and that's something we often forget, because you get something like a red deer, humongous heavy animal, but the young are the vulnerable ones, and it's there where the controls operate. So the lynx will come round and patrol and take a heavy mortality on the young, which then affects the overall population. So again, young wild boar. And when you think how many piglets they produce, it's done for that reason, that there's an intact ecosystem, there's lots of predation going on.
James, anything else you want to mention on attitudinal points, and also maybe your experience on modern communication options?
Yeah, I think I'd say I'm conscious of the influence which new media can have over these types of debates, and sometimes that can be actually perceived in a negative way. For example, the way in which the beaver reintroduction was promoted in Scotland was incredibly successful, I think, and there's some animosity felt within the local community surrounding the Knapdale trial area, which suggests that their opinions weren't heard during the public consultation that happened in over the last 10, 15 years. And you'd have sort of meetings like this in town halls to discuss whether it is a good idea or not, and they were flooded by people coming from cities such as Edinburgh or wherever who were very much for this idea, and their opinions weren't heard, and as a result the reintroduction, I think I'm not sure how the attitudes are towards beavers now. I think they're better now. They've got some experience of living with them, but I think they kind of went ahead and did it without really listening to the farmers and the landowners, and so I'm conscious of the power of social media to kind of build momentum for Lynx reintroduction, for example. But I think there's more deliberative ways of including the different perspectives, and that's something I'm trying to work on at the moment in Edinburgh, organising a human geography seminar to bring in the National Farmers Union Scotland, the Scottish Gamekeepers Association, Scottish Land and Estates who represent the landowners, just to kind of, not to build consensus, but to try and get people talking about it early on, because these types of projects are unlikely to happen for a good 5, 10 years really. So I think it's just good, as Rick was blogging last night, it's good to talk about these things. So
it's interesting that I think the point that David West sort of prompted us to consider about working through those relevant peer groups, the land-based peer groups that will influence each other and learn from each other, and reduce the suspicion when they're talking to each other. And you can sell beavers, they can understand beavers maybe through the issue of ecosystem health and the benefits they'll get from that, for their land and all the enterprises associated with their land. Could they see that with lynx? Would they see a predator? In my experience is some of them are interested in vermin control, and some of them are just genuinely, because they're macho males, interested in an awesome, it's not that awesome, but it's a predator, and it has got that sort of, some of them can relate to that from the masculine perspective, if you like. But there's not such a wide-ranging ecosystem health benefit that you could communicate about lynx, is there?
No, I mean, I could see if you could get, I can understand the reasons why. I could see if it was a rabbit-caging only animal that was also able to control deer, you're potentially onto a winner. If it could come out of a bottle and you could sell it as a pesticide or something, they'd all be buying it.
Could you persuade them to eat badgers?
That would be a real hit then.
But if you talk about something that is, the trouble I think also is there's an element of peer pressure in terms of how your neighbours view what you do. And if you are deliberately doing something where it is known that lands will be eaten,
but if the experience is lambs are not eaten...
No, exactly, that's what I'm saying. But clearly in some, depending on the animal, in some situations, large numbers of animals are lambs, and I think that's
consistently persistent.
depending on the animal husbandry, I think is the determining factor.
But then they would learn that together, wouldn't they? About
I guess it sort of links to this whole, maybe this is a bigger and deeper subject. I went through 3 years of agricultural training, and I don't think I went to a single ecology discussion. I spent 5 years as a QAG advisor advising farmers on the environment, and most of the time I found myself explaining in simple terms what natural succession is about. I think there's a real missed opportunity at the moment that probably today, if you go through forestry college or agricultural college, you are shown growth curves, how to get maximum yield out of your fields, how to maximise your animal production. Now you might be told a bit about diversification because of changes in cap, but I bet you don't have a single lecture or lesson on ecology. So I've become a bit wiser to the whole issue of the fact that we spend most of our time fighting nature rather than working with nature. And with foresters, it's a classic when you start talking about natural regeneration. Quite often, that is seen as actually really bad management code. You know, why don't we stick them in tubes? Because that's how we grow to it. There is a bigger issue here, and I think the issue of the top prey species and its link in a fully functioning ecosystem. I'm afraid, as a skeptic, I sort of feel we've gone too far in highly managed lowland England to get back to a point where you have got a properly functioning ecosystem as it would have been. But I do think there are parts of Scotland and other parts, and maybe some islands and so on, where it may be possible to do it. But I do struggle in my mind with getting the full works, Lynx, bear. I remember at college going back, doing a piece of work that was looking at attitudes to wild wood. I'm sure people here are much more experienced about this than me. But people used to fear the wild wood because of the beasts in there. And there is something still in us, I think, that fears the wild wood, if it is truly wild. And you've got a huge job to do, I think, in heavily populated parts of lowland England to get people to accept animals which they perceive as being threats and potentially dangerous. And I don't know how you tackle that.
I hear that. I find, we'll come to Alison quickly, that there's a kickback from materialism from people that actually do want elemental experience. That means they do want elemental experiences, they do want to go in there, and they do want a frisson of risk sometimes. So I think but there's a mixed emotion. People have mixed emotions about this. So I don't see it as all negative, the fear of the wildwood. No. Quickly on your thing about cat and lynx, I think it's the same issue. Is it a creature of wilderness? I think it's the same issue as beavers. Actually, leopards, puma, and lynx survive in suburbs and are invisible throughout their range, and they have got very big geographical ranges, and they do survive, in the shadows of humans. And so it isn't. You don't just need big wildernesses for them. Alison first, and then yourself.
I just wanted to take slight issue with something David said. It didn't feel quite right, and it was this notion of a sort of blanket feeling or a categorisation of what stage we're at in any given place with our sort of ecological fullness or not fullness. Because it just feels to me, we can't really say that, can we? And we don't really think that. Because while, at this particular spot, we might not have the trophic cascade or whatever, but sort of round the corner behind me or down the bottom end of my garden, there's something completely different going on. And it's that sense of actually all these things are very much more interwoven and there's a more fluid. Do ecologists think like that?
I don't know. I think I was thinking at the higher, more dramatic end once you start talking about the big species.
It's obviously more it might be more conspicuous.
As someone who keeps bees now, I'm amazed at all the things that happen in nature. I had no idea it happened before, and at all various levels, there's all sorts of things going on we don't understand. But
my sense was we might be more flexible than we think.
My limited understanding of the fully functioning ecosystem as was. I look at vast branches of lowland England, and I struggle to see how you're ever going to get back to that point. And that's, I guess, was my point. But I think there are you've got such a long way to go there, and so many issues to contend with, because it's so artificial, if you like, whereas there are other parts of the country where the distance to travel is perhaps less, and that's been said. For example, grazing in the uplands, at the moment there is a reduction. Post CAP reform 2013, who knows what's going to happen? It's always up and down. But I just think if you've got large areas, elements of maybe cropping or fairly small populations, I think it's probably there are easier places to target. I wouldn't put it this way. I wouldn't want to try to get the funding for a Lynx introduction problem in southeast England. Sorry, a Lynx introduction project in southeast England to control deer. The battles I would have to win to get that through.
I mean, these things may not happen in set piece ways like that, but it's
Might be easier in Kielder.
yeah. Sorry, but
I was going to sort of like counter-argue with that, because having had a Facebook conversation with my friend in Bavaria the other night, and saying what I was doing and where I was going, and I mentioned about reintroducing wild boar, and he said, oh, you're going ballistic round their area. I said, well, aren't the hunters controlling them? No, they're just going ballistic, and all the agricultural people are going daft because they're raiding all the crops and tearing great holes in them and whatnot. Surely you have the hunters, yeah, but they're shooting deer and they're shooting pigs, but they just don't seem to be getting on top of it. Maybe if you're looking at lynx, and obviously I've reintroduced them in parts of Germany and whatnot, maybe we should be looking at southeast of England where you've got muntjac deer and wild boar now, numbers, but you haven't got those high concentrations of sheep.
Yes.
And looking at maybe the east coast of Scotland where it's mainly agricultural, but the deer population's increasing, particularly roe deer and whatnot, but you haven't got the sheep problem.
also
So
I
maybe
think
looking at target areas.
yeah.
East Anglia.
I think there are a lot of sheep on the east coast of Scotland, looking at the numbers.
I think, yeah.
There's a
Well, you
map
said something
actually,
about moving that away.
Just in the back, on the back of that,
But-
shows
But also,
But maybe
when
is this
these things
sort of-
happen, they have to have the other measures, the training of the landowners and the advisors, so the outreach, the flag officer equivalents, and all that support needs to happen and be trained and be ready, so the teething problems farmers and landowners can get advice and support with the teething problems.
If you want a devil's advocacy, does anybody here quiche? How many sheep have you got?
Little smallholding 30.
Okay, we've 1,500 sheep. Okay? So we are not a very big sheep farm, as far as our part of the world goes. And I took a farmer's trip to Bavaria maybe 2-3 years ago, principally to look at beavers. On one of the days we were there, we chatted, we met the guys from the State Forest Department, and we had a chat about this. And some of the things that came out of this very clearly were that, one, Britain has very many more sheep than most of the other European countries. If you look at the west and you look at sort of wooded gills and the bottom of the valleys that we live in, I can, look at you and even think about your own farm, I'm not sure that we would have much pasture at all that wasn't within 200 metres of woodland. And at this point in time, before the first 150 start lambing, this is our quiet time. And our quiet time with these sheep is checking them once a day, and then every weekend, or at least one or 2 days a week, you bring them in, you sort the feet, you sort them for maggots, you do all sorts of different things, and that's just routine. If I have to employ anybody to go around those sheep, that costs me another 80 quid a day, and I don't want to spend that money. And when it comes to it, we have, again, when you talk to the guys in Bavaria, the sheep they have were kind of incidental. Most of the people we spoke to had these sheep because they were paid by the water companies to use them to graze the dam walls. So that they basically walked through the countryside in an old roving type structure. They're there to graze the dam walls to consolidate the vegetation so the Danube doesn't burst. Most of them were nowhere near Lynx. Where you had sheep in Lynx areas, they had to bring them into sheds at night, because if you didn't bring them into sheds at night, they got eaten. And there weren't very many of them. There were different breeds to the ones we got here. They were not kept in sort of like mountain situations or in free open pasture the way that we keep sheep here, and have kept sheep here since the time of the Cistercian monks. So they've been that way for 1,000 years plus. And sheep at the moment are valuable. 2.5 years ago we were taking 20 kilo lambs to market and those 20 kilo lambs weren't making £37. Now those 20 kilo lambs are making £82. Because the pound's fallen against the value of the euro, sheep numbers are going to go up, and sheep are something that are worth doing. But to give you some sort of like idea, even from my own point of view, our sheep that this year or next year probably will produce. They'll have a turnover somewhere in the region of 75 to 80,000. There is no headage payment for those sheep, so the money you produce from those sheep is the money they generate themselves. By the time you take the farm mortgage off that 75,000 dwindles to profit of about 20, and that's before you pay for all your dosing stuff, any labour, any dip, anything at all you need to pay to put into those sheep. And the west coast of Britain, you can't produce anything else. You can't grow corn because the climate's too wet, and the landscape doesn't allow it. It's too clay or it's too steep. So it's a livestock rearing area. As cattle numbers decline because they are really unviable, if you think sheep are disastrous, then I can tell you the suckler cows we have, we're keeping for the pleasure of their company. Then it really becomes something that is just desperately impossible at this stage. And when it comes to come back to the Bavarian experience, having taken those guys round, one, they pointed out the numbers of sheep, the disparity in the breeds, the numbers, the fact that they're kept in a completely different way. And then the final point that one of the guys made is when they're talking about the compensation for these sheep. He asked one of the guys there whether they have any pedigree sheep. And of course they don't. They just have like sheep as pets. And so if I get, just to give you a comparison, if a lynx, jumps into one of my fields that's full of black Welsh mountains and it kills 10 black Welsh mountains, well, they're worth, 70, 80 quid each. So, I guess that's probably bearable. If it jumps into a field and we've got blue-faced Leicesters in there and it kills 10 of them, well, those sheep might be worth, variously 400 or 500 quid each. And when it then, and the next stage on from that, given a situation whereby you're trying to persuade people to deal with this, is you have to consider my entire income is not farming. I'm not dependent on this, but for the guys that are dependent on it, they wouldn't consider it for a second. And if you advance it to them, they would consider you to be a lunatic. Now, the beaver situation, honestly, guys, is hard enough. Getting to the stage where you try to have an acceptance that this is rational and reasonable, and you can move forward with this animal is difficult. And your fear of the wild group is a big part of it. They're afraid of the dark. That's what it comes to. When you start to talk about these other things, you lump them together because people think reintroduction is a broad church. It just doesn't make sense to the other people you've got to try and persuade to come on this journey with you at all. And that, realistically, is what came back from the trip we ran to Bavaria where we looked at this. And that's without even beginning to consider rules, which were a completely different situation altogether.
I think that what you're saying is why these things as a proposition in abstract are pretty meaningless, and you can get all kinds of ill-informed responses. And I think they do have to come with learning and training and field visits and demonstrations and seeing the thing for real, and maybe in their own country for real in some kind of controlled way, which is happening in beaver. So I think we're not talking about abstract propositions, which can be scary to people.
And also I don't think we're talking about doing this for a good 5-10 years either. And
the circumstances that you've just been very well described ain't going to change in 5 to 10 years.
Yeah,
but
it's a huge cultural change, isn't it? And it's a cultural change where you've got a community of people, especially in farming, that is getting smaller and smaller. So as we sit here, you look at the medium-sized farms going because they can't make any money out of milking 120 cows. Their fathers maybe milked 14. They can make no profit out of 120. They give up. Their families go. The schools close. What happens is their land is then, the house will be bought with a 5-acre paddock, and somebody will live in a very pretty part of the world and rent a paddock out and it'll be cut for silage, and then the land will go to bigger farmers, who have, some staff, but they're very, very busy people, whizzing around in quad bikes or Land Rovers, whatever else to check it. Their numbers of stock go up. It's very hard to see how you do this.
But what I'm saying is, if sheep farming is becoming increasingly unprofitable,
it's becoming profitable. It's becoming more profitable. It's going the other way, and numbers are going to go up.
But isn't that because there's a lot of people that have got out of the game, and so there's fewer suppliers?
There's interesting mood music at the moment. If you talk to a lot of leaders in the farming world, you look at some of the population graphs and you look at what's happening in developing countries, and this whole issue of food resources, and basically where you can grow food, we should be growing food, and possibly more intensively, I actually have quite a concern, and I think it's going to seriously impact on some of our landscape scale work, which is not your rewilding, just landscape scale work. I can see a post-2013 cap reform which actually goes back to encouraging farmers to produce again. And I think we could go back to headage payments and away from area-based payments potentially in the not too distant future. The impact of that could be huge, and it also, if you take away the bribe, the agri-environment scheme, there are, I would say, almost every single landscape scale project in the country is reliant on agri-environment. We are in a very challenging time at the moment, and parts of the UK that have got soil and suitable land for both growing crops and grazing animals, some would argue that's where we should be focusing all our effort. And the farming world is getting quite buoyant at the moment about a new revolution of agricultural growth.
I also think that we shouldn't just tar everybody with the same brush. We know not all people in our own professional camps think alike. I find not all farmers think alike on these issues, and so, you know, there's no one mainstream response.
But there are
and these are transient animals. These are not going to... Okay, the issue is if they misbehave and plague one farm persistently, then that becomes an issue. But if that doesn't happen, and it's only one loss occasionally, then I think there could be
I think there's a few real exceptional characters out there who often own their own land, and the hard business finance of farming isn't that critical for them. I haven't yet been to the Ned estate. I've met the guy, very interesting. I'd like to see his balance sheet. But I think the majority of farmers do fall into what's been described. And certainly, as someone who gets farming literature, I've seen some really interesting stuff about as society develops and changes diet and expect to have a greater meat proportion and so on. People are picking this stuff up, and people are seeing perhaps a renaissance in agriculture in this country again. And that's going to be a real challenge in the context of what you're proposing, I think.
Yeah,
last point on Lynx, because we must move on with time.
Yeah. From that perspective, it seems really we need to take a lot of this on board and really think maybe a decade or two ahead for areas in Scotland where it's primarily forest and red deer country. And look at places like Kielder, because you've also got the Cheviots and sheep country right next door, so that might not be so clever. But yeah, to take that on board, I think that's the important thing. And if we can't, I'm pretty sure if we can't get the farmers and the hunting and shooting fishing community on board for a trial, it's not going to happen. So that's where we need to do our work. Really.
Just quickly before, on a sort of more optimistic note, the sea eagle reintroduction in Mull, that's bringing in £5 million a year, according to the latest RSPB study on tourism. So I think you're not just looking at a loss maker, basically. I think there's potential, perhaps, to bring about a different type of experience.
The Hearts example does illustrate you can brand an area and benefit from it, from things. People have really embraced. If you look at the evaluation of what's been done in the Hearts, people have embraced it. People are branding. The whole settlement's been branded. James is right about the number of people who flock to these enclosures. You look at the photographs, people really do want that, and they're coming from beyond the region. You know, it's a regional catchment. But
I suppose my only comment to that would be £5 million is nothing compared to agricultural incomes and so forth. You've got to get it into perspective.
I think most of these things will happen when people are ready for them, and we have to accept that. I think people who are interested in it can just raise the profile of the issues and the potential benefits, and maybe it happens when society is ready. And if you push it too hard, people will be suspicious. So you can be too impatient and for your own peril.
And the counter, hey, at the end of the day, it would be nice to be optimistic about most of this. But realistically, yes, you look at sea eagles in Mull, and then you look at what happened with sea eagles in Suffolk, which was a disastrous, cacophony of bad communication, and a project which ran itself into the ground, squandered considerable resource, and it has given organisations like the RSPB such a kick-in that it probably will not be picked up again by them in a lifetime. And there's a crackingly good counter-example of how something like that can go.
And Natural England used lack of money as a way of closing
Natural England were told to stop it.
Yeah.
Politically, they were told to stop it. And one of the other problems with much of this is that for things like this to happen, you have to have political courage. And time after time with beavers or whatever other species, Franz Beera, you see a time when an idea is espoused, and until you actually arrive at political circumstance whereby somebody in a position of power says, do it, at whatever time this comes, then it will not happen. It doesn't matter how good an idea is or bad an idea is. And at this point in time, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you look at sort of the way that the Forestry Commission has been reorganised, what could potentially happen to the Environment Agency, the fact that Natural England has been reduced to a wreck of what it was, then do you honestly think there is political support or political will there to see anything that is difficult, contentious come through? If we manage to get to the stage where we actually find a valley where these guys can go, to run a sentient trial, it will be by the most unpredictable of narrow political whiskers that you will ever get a license to do.
But you say that, and Rosanna Cunningham, the former Environment Minister of Scotland, went up to the Highlands to have lunch with David Hetherington, Doug Richardson, to discuss the idea, and she was like, well, can we go and let them out tomorrow, kind of thing. How do we bring this project forward? So there is some political enthusiasm for the idea in Scotland, at least, perhaps not England.
Rosanna Cunningham was the person that turned down the first beaver trial in Knapdale. She was the person that signed the letter that said they couldn't have permission to do it. So politics is a very, very fickle thing.
But also these things often do not always happen in a set-piece political, the politicians call the shots. Often there's a ground, that somebody will suggest something from the side and it will go all the way and hit the target. We ought to move on. I think maybe we should say we've had our general discussion on reintroductions and rewilding and the tactics of all that, and finish on wild grazing. Thank you very much, Peter and James. We'll move on to wild grazing from Derek. So, thank you.